Hello everyone, my name is Emily Kosick and I'm the Knowledge Manager for the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment. Welcome to today's session, exploring job-related burnout and what it means for public safety personnel. Before we get started today, there are a few housekeeping items I want to go through. First of all attendees are in listen-only mode, and that's to limit the feedback and noise that can often happen in one of these sessions. Today's session is also being recorded. You'll be sent a copy tomorrow, so if you miss anything, you can watch it again. The GoToWebinar launch window can be blocked by some organizations, so if you're having trouble hearing or seeing, you may have to join us by phone. Lastly, we'll be looking for audience questions at the end of the session, so please send us your questions through the question box or be ready to raise your hand to ask your questions. For your information, the slides for today will not be shared. They are the property of our presenter, so we ask that you not share them from the video either. So now I'm actually pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Dawn McCreary, and I will turn it over to you. I'll turn the sharing over right now.
Great. All right. Whoops, sorry. You should be able to see my screen now.
Yep, we can see it.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks everyone for joining me today. I'm just going to, there we go, find the button that gets rid of that. And I'm going to, again, welcome everybody to today's talk, and I'm happy to be here. Just for lack of my ability to speak with you, I'm going to turn off my video. So I'm hoping that I'm going to do this and everybody's going to still be able to see me. So just a sec here. There we go. All right.
We can still see, no problem.
All right, that's fantastic. Okay, before I get going, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Qualicum Beach, British Columbia, Canada, which sits within the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, and particularly the Qualicum First Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge the importance of the ancestral lands, treaty lands, and territories of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of Canada, and pay tribute to their legacy of past, present, and future. All right, so what I'm going to try and do today is going to be, in 45 minutes, a pretty complicated task. I'm going to talk a little bit about what job-related burnout is and what it isn't. I think the majority of what I'm going to be talking about is what it isn't. Discuss the prevalence of burnout and the reasons why it's difficult to assess prevalence. Discuss the main causes of job-related burnout, the correlates and the outcomes with both the physical and mental health emphasis, but also an emphasis on work performance. Discuss the evidence for interventions designed to reduce workplace burnout in employees, and I'll mention briefly programs designed to prevent workplace burnout. So let's start off with, again, the basics of burnout, what it is. So burnout was initially first talked about in the 1970s, but it didn't really crystallize as a scientific construct until the 1980s. It was conceptualized by Christina Maslak in California, but she had a lot of help from her colleagues, including Michael Leiter from Acadia University in Canada. So starting in the 1980s, they started building the concept of burnout, and it picked up a lot. In fact, as of this week, there are 1.28 million hits in Google Scholar just for the word burnout. So it's a very popular concept. And lately, it's mostly studied within the area of the social psychology of health, occupational health psychology. Some clinical psychologists study, a lot of industrial organizational psychologists, study it. But that's kind of the main focus, for the study of job-related burnout. But because of its popularity, it's actually been picked up recently by the World Health Organization and included in the International Classification of Diseases. So it was first introduced in the ICD-10, but most recently it's been updated, and the definition of burnout has been it's been further developed. It's been expanded, and this is what it is. So on this slide is the actual definition of job-related burnout from the ICD-11. And it's actually almost identical to the definition that Maslak and her colleagues created in the 1980s. So I'm just going to read it here for you. Burnout is a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. It is characterized by three dimensions: the feeling of energy depletion or exhaustion, and that's actually the main definition that a lot of people use, but it also is evidenced by increased mental distance from one's job or feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job, and a reduced sense of professional efficacy. And by that, I mean a reduced sense of your ability to do your job well. And burnout refers specifically to the phenomena in an occupational context and should not be described or should not be used to describe experiences in other areas of your life. Now, the ICD-11 goes on to note that burnout is not depression, nor is it any other mood disorder. It is also not an adjustment disorder, a disorder specifically associated with stress, or an anxiety or fear-related disorder. In fact, burnout is not a psychological disorder at all. It is a workplace syndrome. And as a result, there's no diagnostic criteria for it. There's no way of, as a result, because there's no diagnostic criteria, there's no way of diagnosing someone as having burnout or not having burnout. And because of that, there's no way of really determining what percentage of the population or what percentage of a workforce actually is burnt out. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So what is burnout not, or what burnout is not, I guess is probably the better way to put it. So this is going to be sort of the complicated part of the discussion, because burnout has entered our daily lexicon as a synonym for depression and exhaustion. In other words, when people say they're burnt out, or their colleagues are burnt out, or they're feeling burnt out, what they're really saying is they're feeling depleted and exhausted. Sometimes is used as a synonym for depression as well. But burnout, again, is not just the exhaustion element. It's exhaustion plus cynicism plus that lack of professional efficacy. So when you're discussing burnout, again, you must consider all three elements, of burnout. But again, because most people tend to focus on just the exhaustion element and linking it to depression, it's really interesting to note that other scientists who work within the burnout field, but especially those focusing in the area of workplace mental health, they continue to focus only on the exhaustion element. So if you look at the burnout literature, what you're going to find is a hodgepodge of definitions. Some people focusing solely on the exhaustion element and its link with depression, but other people focusing on exhaustion, cynicism, some people focusing on exhaustion and a lack of, professional efficacy, and some people focusing on all three. But again, the WHO definition and the definition that's been created in the 1980s focuses on the notion of job-related burnout as an emphasis on, again, exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and the lack of professional efficacy. It's also interesting to note that burnout is not, the same thing as caregiver burden and compassion fatigue. So they are separate constructs, although there is overlap between them. So for those who don't know, compassion fatigue is often experienced by those in the counseling professions, professions that require an individual to have compassion for other people. Sometimes that compassion does lead to a sense of fatigue, which can be very similar in ways to the notion of exhaustion or emotional exhaustion. And caregiver burden is another element that is often related to burnout. And as a lot of us are beginning to care more for children and those and our parents, and others in our lives, especially during a global pandemic, I think we all have a great idea about what caregiver burden might represent. So as I said earlier, burnout is not a recognized clinical diagnosis. So as a result, you can't say really that you are burned out, because there's really no way of diagnosing burnout and measuring burnout specifically, especially in sense of that notion of a category or caseness, who's burnt out versus who's not burnt out. But still, that hasn't stopped people from asking about the prevalence of burnout, especially by occupation. People want to know, what are the most burnt out occupations that are out there? And so, as I say, if you look at burnout and prevalence, if you search for that, you're going to find a lot of individual studies, but you're also going to find a number of systematic reviews and meta-analyses comparing studies. And I put a few of them up here, and I really want to talk to you about them, but you can see that little graphic I've got down there in the lower right-hand corner. That's a pile of salt. So what I'm basically saying is, take this with a grain of salt, and you'll see why in just a second. So there's been a lot of burnout research in specific occupations, specifically physicians, nurses, and teachers. And physicians, there have been over 182 studies of burnout, and they were summarized in a systematic review and meta-analysis by Rotenstein et al. In 2018 in JAMA. And what they found is a number of different things. They found that between 0 and 85%, of the samples in their study found, so between 0 and 85% of the people in the studies, were burnt out. But what they found that of those 182 studies, there were 142 different ways of creating an overall burnout score or some kind of caseness. And by caseness, I mean burnt out versus not burnt out. So what that tells you is there is no consistent way of measuring or defining burnout. But let me step back and say, well, how do we measure burnout? There are several scales out there. The most popular, the most common is the Maslak Burnout Inventory. And it's a short self-report scale that people can give to the people in your study. And what it does is it tells you the degree of symptoms you have in all three areas: exhaustion, cynicism, and lack of professional efficacy. And what these people in these types of studies have done is they've taken those three scale scores or the scores from another measure of burnout. There are 2 or 3 more commonly used measures of burnout out there. And what they've done is they've massaged them. They've created their own cutoff scores that identifies burnout versus non-burnout. And as you can see, there's no consistency in the way that's done because of 182 studies in that meta-analysis, 142 different ways of creating that overall burnout versus non-burnout score. You can see that there was another study done with nurses, and they found that between 29 and 36% of their populations across those studies, they were burnt out according to their definitions of burnout. And there was 5 studies, a study by Reardon et al. In 2020 that summarizes the results of 5 studies in EMS, and they found that between 15 and 56 people, there have been no large-scale systematic reviews in firefighters, police, or correctional officers, or other public safety personnel. And again, that's not a bad thing because, again, because burnout is not a recognizable clinical diagnostic disorder, there's no way of determining caseness because there's no gold standard against which to determine whether or not somebody is burnt out or not. So usually that gold standard from these types of questionnaires are created by comparing the questionnaire results to the results of a diagnostic clinical interview by a clinician. And that's the missing part here. So again, people can ask about prevalence of burnout, but the problem is it's really just not going to to happen. Now again, I've talked about the prevalence of burnout and some of the barriers to it. I also want to note that there's a lack of a consistently used definition of burnout. So we have the WHO definition of burnout, which really results from the Maslak et al.'s definition of burnout from the 1980s, the original one. But a recent review by Kanu just this year showed that between 1974 and 2019, of the studies that were published, there were 13 different definitions of occupational burnout, that were presented in that published literature. So again, there's not a lot of consistency in the way we measure burnout and the way we try and determine who's burnt out versus who's not burnt out. But again, not everybody is using that World Health Organization definition of burnout, which again stems from the Maslak definition of burnout. And again, I've talked a lot about caseness and the problems around caseness. So I'm not going to go over that in any more detail. But what I do want to do is give you an example of how you can present burnout data to an organization. And this is a study that I did back in the early 20-teens, when I was working for the Department of National Defense. So I think it was in 2010 or late 2009, I was out at the Combat Training Center at CFB Gagetown with my colleague, Megan Thompson. And we were talking to the senior officers at the Combat Training Center, and they were talking about how they were having to do more with less. And having to do more with less to me immediately sort of said burnout, because as you'll see in a second, one of the causes of burnout is actually a reduction of resources and increased time spent doing your work as a result of that reduction in resources. So I asked the senior leadership about burnout in their personnel, and they said they didn't know. And that must have struck a nerve because a few months later, I got an email saying that I've been asked to study burnout in the 8 schools at the Combat Training Center. There were 5 at CFB Gagetown and 3 in Ontario. So I went out and I actually studied burnout. I used the Maslak burnout inventory and I assessed burnout in all 3 subscales. And I got 651 instructors and support staff at the Combat Training Center. And the findings were not good. So I went back to my senior leadership and I said, can I have another group of people, a similar group of instructors in the Canadian Armed Forces, so that I can compare and just make sure these findings are not related to the Combat Training Center, and maybe they might be related to the situation amongst instructors in the Canadian Armed Forces writ large. So they gave me permission to go to the Canadian Forces Leadership and Recruit School in Saint-Jean, Quebec. That's where the majority of basic training is done, but there's also some leadership courses done for people throughout their career. So there's a wide variety of instructors across all of the Army, Navy, and Air Force there. So I did the same thing there. So CFLRS and Combat Training Center. So this is how I presented the data. So anything in blue is bad. So moderate to high levels of emotional exhaustion and cynicism are bad. Low levels of professional efficacy are bad, because that's basically saying you just can't do your job. So let's start off with professional efficacy. And you can see that pretty much the difference between the Combat Training Center and CFLRS was pretty low across all 3. Roughly 2/3, almost 70% of instructors were low to moderate in their sense of professional efficacy. In other words, they were bad. But where the differences were, and I've got them highlighted in red, were for the emotional exhaustion and the cynicism. And what you see is that the emotional exhaustion and cynicism were higher in the negative elements were higher in the Combat Training Center than they were at the Canadian Forces Leadership and Recruit School. So whereas 20 to 38% were high in either, or high or moderately high in exhaustion, and 26 to 54% were high or moderately cynical at CFLRS, between 25 and 71% were either high or moderately exhausted at CTC, and 26 to 54% were either high or moderately cynical. So this for me was an excellent way of presenting not burnout caseness, in other words, what degree of people are burnt out, but rather what degree of people are experiencing moderate or high symptoms of burnout. And this spoke very well to the senior leadership at both the Combat Training Center and the Leadership Recruit School. So again, I prefer not to talk about caseness and levels of burnout, but rather levels of poor exhaustion, poor cynicism, and poor efficacy. That's those areas in blue. So I said earlier, I'm going to talk about the causes of burnout. And this research has been underway since the 1980s, and I have to say, because there's 1.28 million citations for burnout in Google Scholar right now, you can be sure that a lot of them are looking at what's the cause of job-related burnout symptoms. And because we've had so much time since the construct was initially developed, we can say that there's been a lot of longitudinal research as well as a lot of correlational research. So we know a lot about the causes because we've been able to track workers over time. We've been able to assess how changes in things like workload, time pressure, and lack of resources can actually cause increases in burnout symptoms over time. So these are the main symptoms of job-related burnout, and almost all of these have been linked to causing burnout over time. So I mentioned heavy workload, time pressure, a lack of resources, but also a lack of job control. Some people lack control in how they do their job, and what research has shown is if you can give people back that control, their burnout symptoms, they do actually decrease, but I'll talk a little bit about that later. Role conflict. Some people have jobs in which there are conflicting aspects of the role. They're supposed to do A, but B kind of gets in the way of A, and it's how do you prioritize A versus B? That's one of the biggest conflicts out there. Role ambiguity, not quite having a firmly described job classification. Lack of social support in the job. That can come from managers or it can come from your work colleagues. And as I said, That's what I say, lack of support from supervisors, lack of feedback from your supervisors, about how you're doing, lack of participation in decision making, a requirement for emotional empathy, lack of sufficient rewards, either monetary or social. So these are the main symptoms that are known to cause burnout in people over time. So changes in these in the negative direction do cause increases in burnout symptoms. So jobs with the highest level of burnout symptoms, again, this is there have only been a few studies looking at this, and so instructors, first responders, nurses, physicians, social workers, doctors, that's already there, sorry, use a different word, but teachers are also included in that as well. Now, I want to state that there has been some work looking at individual causes of burnout, so personality or other aspects within the individual, and there are really very few weak individual correlates of burnout. One that's come up a little bit more consistently than others is the notion of perfectionism. So there is growing evidence that perfectionists do tend to get burnt out more often than non-perfectionists. But again, the associations, they are fairly consistent, but they are kind of weak. Now, I'm going to throw out or give you a couple of examples of how people think burnout works. Now, these are just models that people have suggested. There is some evidence for them, but just because there's some evidence doesn't mean that it is the actual way burnout works, because as you'll see, there are a couple of different models and lots of different ideas. So there's one idea that job stressors lead to emotional exhaustion, and we know that that actually has been that actually is a causal relationship that's been confirmed. And there's another one that says that emotional exhaustion can then lead to cynicism, and again, that causal link has also been confirmed. And that once you have cynicism, that leads to a sense of poor professional efficacy. We don't have any causal data for that. We just have correlational data for that. So we don't quite know if that works. But one thing I do want to note is that when you go back to the original definition of burnout from the World Health Organization, it talks about burnout stemming from job-related stressors that have not been managed well. And by that, we mean they've not been coped with well. So job stressors, remember that stress is not inherently a bad thing. It's stress that we cannot cope with effectively. That's the bad element. So when we cannot cope effectively with stress, then we get what's called strain or negative outcomes. In this case, that negative outcome would be the emotional exhaustion link, which then leads to cynicism later on down the line and potentially poor professional efficacy, according to this developmental model of burnout. But again, this is not the only model of how burnout works. Here's another model. This one was actually just published last year by Gauthier et al. It's a reciprocal model of burnout symptoms. So again, as you see in this model, job stress leads to burnout symptoms. But that link between job stress and burnout systems is what we call mediated by job control and job support. So in other words, if you can enhance somebody's job control and or their job support, you can break the link between job stress and burnout symptoms. So you can actually potentially decrease job stress so that you end up decreasing burnout symptoms. But if you can't control, can't enhance somebody's job control or job support, what this model suggests is that those burnout symptoms you experience as a result of job stress actually leads to more job stress. And those little pluses I've put in the graphic basically say that the relationship between job stress and burnout symptoms is actually weaker than the relationship between burnout symptoms and job stress. So you have job stress leading to burnout symptoms, which has an even stronger relationship to future job stress. So if that makes sense, I hope it does. Sometimes explaining, mediation and moderation is not my forte at early in the morning because I'm not a morning person. So fingers crossed that I explained that well for you. So what are the effects of burnout? Well, there are two different types of effects. There's effects on the individual and effects on an individual's performance. So the symptoms that I have on the left have all been shown via longitudinal data. So we know that burnout symptoms cause increases in depression and anxiety symptoms. And I want to stop here and I want to say that there are some people who feel that the emotional exhaustion element of burnout is really work-related depression. I'm not saying one way or the other. I know the correlations are high, but I also know that the notion of depression is out there, exists. It's a highly recognized set of symptoms, and there are measures out there that assess burnout. But exhaustion is only one element of the broader depression, concept. So again, it probably overlaps with depression, burnout symptoms, especially exhaustion, but it is probably not work-related depression in that sense. But again, people with higher levels of burnout symptoms, as the burnout symptoms increase, so do symptoms of anxiety and depression. There's also a decrease in self-esteem. There's a decrease in sleep quality, which leads to insomnia for some people, or really a high level of sleep disturbance, not just insomnia, the inability to sleep, but poor quality sleep. There's also an increase in physical symptoms, physical exhaustion, and things like headaches and weight loss and musculoskeletal issues. So burnout symptoms actually can have a physical manifestation in some people. There's an increase in substance abuse, alcohol, other drugs, and there's also spillover of burnover symptoms into home life, specifically marital and family conflict. So people who are experiencing work-related burnout tend to bring some of that burnout home with them, and again, that can have a negative influence on the family. I also want to say that the graphic I chose for the right is just a graphic to offset the what I really wanted to talk about in terms of the symptoms, but there was one really interesting symptom they had over in that graphic on the right, and that's irritability. Irritability is a really interesting thing because irritability also is an overlap with one element of depression I just want to mention briefly, and that is when you look at the gender balance of a lot of public safety occupations, especially firefighters and police. You see that it's a majority of male employees in those occupations, and there's increasing suggestion that men display and experience depression slightly differently than women. And some of the ways in which they experience depression differently is that sense of irritability, anger, frustration, but also violence. And so they tend to act out, whereas the standard symptoms of depression are about rumination and taking all of those symptoms and taking them inward. So men tend to act out more, and irritability may be one of those symptoms that might be really interesting within the public safety context. As I said earlier, there are also work-related effects, for burnout. So organizations that have a high rate of burnout symptoms among their employees can't just expect poor health and well-being amongst their employees, but they also should expect negative impacts on employee performance. And that includes reduced levels of job effectiveness and productivity, lower levels of job satisfaction, and increased levels of job withdrawal. And this is a really important thing. So greater absenteeism within the occupation, greater intentions to leave, but then actual greater turnover, throughout the year. So as I said, there's also lower levels of job commitment. So people just aren't committed to doing the job or doing the job well. There are greater interpersonal conflict at work. So you can have greater instances of workplace conflict, like bullying behavior, but also arguing, just people not getting along well. Greater disruption of job tasks, so jobs don't get done, as well or as efficiently. But burnout can also be contagious, especially the cynical element of burnout. And that is one thing that employers don't really realize. And why burnout is contagious, we don't really know. Is everybody just experiencing the symptoms of the same workplace organization, the negative elements and the toxicity of the workplace organization? Or is there some kind of social contagion, going on? Again, that's not something that we know a lot of. Now, I want to talk just very briefly about why it's important to look beyond exhaustion. And I want to bring everybody back to the example I gave earlier about the work I did at the Canadian Armed Forces at the combat training centers and the Canadian Forces Leadership and Recruit School. And what I have here is I've got 3 different columns, so one for emotional exhaustion, one for cynicism, and one for professional efficacy. And I've got a bunch of different symptoms, our predictors, what we call in research world, but really they're just, our outcomes, our causes, are not the outcomes of burnout. And we've got depression, anxiety, sleep disturbance, job satisfaction, and things that you may not know about. I'll tell you a little bit more about. That's affective commitment, normative commitment, vigor, dedication, and absorption. But as you can see, emotional exhaustion is most strongly related to the mental health elements, the sleep, the anxiety, and the depression. It's a little bit, related to job satisfaction, but so is cynicism and professional efficacy. But what professional efficacy and cynicism are most strongly related to are those work variables I was just talking about. So job satisfaction, I just want to state, is not measured just by asking people how satisfied they are with their job. There's actually a fairly large questionnaire that measures job satisfaction in a number of different domains, and we use that questionnaire. So when we talk about job satisfaction, it's not a simple, how satisfied are you, yes or no, or on a scale from 1 to 10. It's using a validated questionnaire that gets at quite a different elements of job satisfaction. But let's talk a little bit about affective and normative commitment, because when you're working in an organization, these are important elements. And these scales come from the Myers and Allen organizational commitment scale. So affective commitment, it really denotes an emotional attachment to or identification with and involvement within an organization. So how involved are you with the organization you work with? How much do you identify with it? How attached are you with it? And people who are high in affective commitment, well, that's a good thing. They are less likely to leave, they perform well, et cetera, et cetera. Normative commitment reflects the perceived obligation to remain in an organization. So I can't leave the organization because they need me or they need my services, or be letting my fellow colleagues, my work colleagues, down. So you want high levels of affective commitment, but you want low levels of normative commitment. Sorry, you also want high levels of normative commitment. You basically want to feel that you're obligated to remain. Vigor and dedication and absorption, they come from a work engagement scale. So they are measures of how engaged you are in your work. So vigor refers to high levels of energy and mental resilience while working. So in other words, you're being very vigorous at your job, you're throwing a lot of energy at it, you're willing to invest that energy in your work, and you're persistent in the face of difficulty. Dedication is characterized by a sense of significance or enthusiasm, inspiration, pride. So this wide variety of positive elements you really feel about your job. And absorption is really about that concentration element. How often or how likely are you to become absorbed in your work? That sense of where you're working, so you're just in the zone, you're working and you just lose track of time. That's absorption. Well, as we can see, cynicism is related to, basically, high levels of cynicism is related to a reduction in job satisfaction, a reduction in all of the other elements. So cynicism is really bad for work performance, and also potentially staying in your job, your commitment to your job. And lack of professional efficacy, the higher your professional efficacy, or the lack of professional efficacy. Remember, this is a lack of professional efficacy. So the lower your professional efficacy, the lower your job satisfaction, the poorer your affective commitment, the poorer your normative commitment, the poorer your vigor. So in other words, when you are not experiencing that sense of professional efficacy, you really are not all that committed to your job. So that's an example that I took back to the Combat Training Center and the Leadership Recruit School, senior leadership, to show why burnout was important, not just for the mental health symptoms or the physical health symptoms, but also for these people's careers and their ability to do their job well. So what about burnout related interventions? So typically, what ends up happening for these interventions is that people will come in, people will start to sit back and say, oh, we've got a high degree of burnout in our workplace. How can we reduce the burnout sense, the sense of burnout in the workplace? So they'll bring in people who will develop an intervention to attempt to reduce the burnout in that occupation. And there have been a number of studies that have looked at this. In fact, the systematic review and meta-analysis I'm talking about here had 47 intervention studies that had a passive control group and at least one aspect of burnout measured at least twice. So in other words, it's a minimum pre-post design. Let's measure burnout prior to the intervention, and at least once, if not twice or 3 times, after the intervention is over. So we have 47 studies, and the types of interventions that they studied were these 4 listed up at the top. So the first is the use of cognitive behavioral therapy type techniques. So cognitive behavioral therapy has 3 different elements to it. One is cognitive restructuring, so identifying the dysfunctional thinking habits that you have and changing them. The second element of CBT is behavioral activation, so identify and schedule behaviors and activities that are less demanding, so change your behavior, in other words. Okay, and then that's the second element, and activities that are less demanding, and then gradual exposure with difficult situations. That's the third element of the CBT-based techniques that were used. Another type of intervention is meditation and relaxation techniques. The most common used here is mindfulness-based meditation. But some of them went beyond that and said, oh, the reason people are burnt out is because they lack the skills to do their job well. So, they lack the skills to interact with other people well. So they teach them interpersonal skills development. And then the fourth one is, again, saying that these people don't know how to do their job well. So let's develop their knowledge and their work-related skills. So those were the 4 types of interventions that were identified by this meta-analysis. And again, there were 47 studies included. So were they effective? Were those interventions effective? And the reality is, no, not really. So the interventions, they cause a small decrease in overall burnout scores, but remember, those overall burnout scores are really highly manipulated, scores. They really are not, indicative of the broader concept of burnout. But then again, when they actually did use the measures that actually assessed all 3 elements, these types of indications, they only had a small effect on the emotional exhaustion element of burnout. Interventions did not have any effect at all on cynicism or professional efficacy levels, which are the other 2 elements of burnout. And the small changes in overall burnout scores, they appeared to be relatively stable over 6 months, but could not be determined robustly. In other words, there weren't a lot of studies that actually went beyond 6 months, and the quality of the studies were actually fairly poor. So we're still kind of iffy on that reduction in emotional exhaustion over, whether or not that small change, that small effect was actually, sustained over time. And the meditation interventions were the most effective at reducing emotional exhaustion. So there was effect, and that actually has been, I'll talk about that in a second, but that's actually a consistent finding. Meditation does appear to be somewhat effective, at reducing or improving mental health, in the workplace, but we can talk about that in a second. And again, there were no differences across the 4 different strategies for reducing burnout symptoms for cynicism or professional efficacy at all. They all performed poorly. So someone can ask, okay, all of those types of interventions are directed towards the individual, but all the causes of burnout are actually organizational and structural. So you're not actually changing the burnout. What you're doing is you're putting the burden of burnout and managing burnout on the individual. And you're basically, the organization, by doing this, is saying, we have no culpability in this. We're not going to change who we are. We're going to actually try and change you, and because burnout's a problem with you. It's not a problem with us. So what has happened is that some interventions for burnout have actually said, oh, you know what, we're the organization, we are the cause of your burnout, we're going to try and change us. So is there a difference between these types of person-directed interventions versus interventions that are directed at the actual organizational causes of these burnouts? So in 2017, Panagiotti et al., they published a meta-analysis that actually compared the effectiveness of interventions designed to address the individual versus organizational changes. And some examples of organizational changes they highlighted were changes in people's schedules, reduction in the intensity or workload, changes to common workflow practices, improving teamwork, changes in evaluation and supervision, reductions in job demand, enhancing job control, and increasing the level of participation in decision making. And what they found was that really interventions designed at the individual level really didn't work. That's just replicating what we found out, what I discussed in the previous slides. But what they found was that interventions designed to improve the organizational causes of burnout were approximately 2.5 times more effective at reducing burnout symptoms compared to those individual level interventions. So again, these findings highlight the importance of addressing the actual causes of burnout, but what they also say is that organizations can change. Organizations can adapt and make things better for their employees, and that those changes do have positive impacts on employee health and burnout. So what about prevention? I mentioned prevention. It's the last thing I wanted to talk about. And the reality is that these types of intervention programs are pretty much the ones that are out there. Organizations don't come into the burnout space saying, I want to prevent burnout in my organization. What they say is, I've got a problem. I have burnout in my organization and I want to get rid of it. But I wanted to highlight briefly a report I did back in 2019, where I was asked to review the effectiveness of programs that helped prevent mental health or poor mental health in veterans and first responders, but also in the general workforce. And what was the effectiveness of those prevention programs? And what we found is that the meta-analyses and systematic reviews that I reviewed for this report showed that, for the most part, workplace interventions designed to prevent poor mental health in the workplace, or designed to prove, as early interventions, to minimize poor mental health after trauma exposure in the workplace, they really didn't work. There were small effects that tended to disappear over 6 months or 3 to 6 months. There was no effects at all. Things like the road to mental readiness, the mental health first aid doesn't really have an impact on the mental health of the person giving it or the mental health of the person it being given to. It does affect the confidence of the person giving it to feel more confident in giving it, but doesn't really have that much of an effect on the mental health of individuals involved. There are potential adverse effects. And again, there's a general poor quality of research being used to assess the effectiveness within this context. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because these findings are really very consistent with the intervention findings for burnout. And one of the most consistent findings is that mindfulness was actually quite promising as a mental health prevention program for the workplace, but more work was needed. And again, in the previous studies for burnout I just talked about, mindfulness showed some of the most promise, as an intervention. But again, that's an individual level intervention, and the causes of poor mental health in the workplace tend to be structural elements within the workplace itself, in the same way that happens with burnout and the organizational causes of burnout. So in summary, burnout is a work-based syndrome focused on emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and a lack of professional efficacy. Its causes are organizationally based, not individually based. Burnout symptoms can have adverse physical and mental health outcomes for individuals, and that's a wide range of both physical and mental health outcomes. Burnout symptoms have adverse impacts on people's performance in the workplace, including leaving the job. Workplace interventions focused on changing the causes of burnout are more effective than interventions focused on the individual coping. These types of interventions also tend to place the burden on the organizations themselves rather than the individuals, and that's important because the known causes of burnout are within the organization. And there's no real evidence for prevention, but intervention research suggests the focus should be on the organizational culture. So I want to thank everybody. I'm willing to take questions right now. You can contact me via my email address, or you can check in with me on LinkedIn. And I'm going to turn on my camera right now, and we can get to some questions.
Okay, so we do have a few questions that have come in. Again, we encourage everybody to send their questions through the questions box or to raise their hand so that I can have you unmuted and ask your question. The first question I have is, what is the frequent use of PTO? What is a frequent use of PTO, sorry?
Sorry, can someone define PTO for me? I'm having one of those moments right now.
It doesn't look like it has it in here. I'll let the person that asked the question provide that to us, and I'll get back to it. So we'll move on to the next question. Is what questionnaire do you use to measure job satisfaction?
There are a number of different questionnaires out there. Oh, that is a good question. I am blanking on that, but if the asker would like to email me, I'd be happy to find that out. I think it's one of Paul Spector's questionnaires, and Paul Spector is an IO psychologist. He has a web page where he does keep copies of his questionnaires. I think he's down in Florida in the States. But if you search Paul Spector, you'll be able to find his website. I believe I used one of his.
All right, so I do have information that PTO means personal time off.
Oh, sorry. Okay, can you then repeat the question now that I know what PTO is?
What is frequent use of PTO? Like, I guess what would be considered frequent use?
I don't really know what frequent use of PTO is in terms of a benchmark. I can't say for certain what's good, what's bad, but we do know that personal time off is a symptom of of burnout, because what ends up happening is that a lot of individuals, they don't really identify the burnout symptoms right away, and so they'll take personal time off. They'll also take vacation as sick leave, sometimes. In other words, instead of taking sick leave, they'll take vacation in hopes that they'll just get over it. So one of the other elements of burnout I didn't mention is that burnout symptoms are not something that can go away after taking a long weekend. It's not something that can go away after taking a week's PTO or a week's sick leave. These symptoms tend to take much longer to dissipate than just a day here or a day there. If you're just tired because you've been working hard on a job, then maybe that kind of recuperation period might work. But in many people who are experiencing higher levels of burnout symptoms, it can take months for those symptoms to lessen, especially if the organization, that nothing changes within the organization itself or the individual. Sometimes individuals will literally leave jobs because they're burnt out. They may not have another job to go to, but they have no other reason to stay within that job. And given the talk about burnout symptoms that we're seeing now within public safety, within nursing, physicians, the health community, the teaching community, that can be a big stressor for people, because they may not want to go to work, or they may be experiencing burnout from work, but they may not have any other job to go to. They may not have any other options, and they probably have financial obligations. So there's a sense of economic insecurity that comes in to play, as well as all that. I know I went off topic there, I'm sorry, but I can talk about this for hours.
That's okay. We did have a question about, you had an earlier chart that had, I believe, cynicism and personal efficacy, and then there were numbers related to that. There was just a question about what the numbers mean in that chart, and what do they represent, and is one high?
Okay, so I had a couple of charts with that.
It was pale greenish blue, I think, and there was a large number of, like, it was anxiety, depression, I think, on the side.
Oh, okay, right. Those were correlations. So those were the correlation coefficients between each of those three subscales of burnout and the measure of the anxiety, the symptoms, the depression symptoms, sleep disturbance, and those measures of work engagement and job satisfaction, and I can't remember what the other one was. But yeah, so those were correlation coefficients. So yeah.
So one would be high, then it would be a perfect relationship between, right?
Yes, 1 or -1 would be a perfect relationship. And you have to remember that when you're interpreting the professional efficacy, dimension, you have to remember that it's the bad element. So if professional efficacy is high, then job engagement is high. But we're really measuring a lack of professional efficacy. So in your head, you have to do a little bit of mental gymnastics.
So I have a question here. Our organization has committed to implementing the national standard for psychological health and safety in the workplace and implementing the psychological health and safety management system. How can this best be implemented in a policing organization?
Oh, I don't know how it can be implemented, but I know it's important to implement, because The psychological standards documents are based, they're scientifically based on the known evidence of the causes of poor mental health in the workplace, and that is and that includes burnout symptoms as well as other mental health symptoms. So improving psychological safety in the workplace, by changing the known causes of burnout and other mental health symptoms, can only have a positive impact on the individual. So how they do that, I don't really know how organizations can do that, but I know that one of the key elements is if you're going to reduce job demand, and you're working in a public safety environment where you cannot control job demand, then what you end up having to do is you have to manage job demand by bringing in more staff, and that is often a choke point and a barrier for organizations. And so that's, I think, one of the key things, but you might be able to offset some of that by increasing things like decreasing things like job ambiguity, increasing things like job control. So you may be able to, even if there are certain things you can't change that are part of the standard and are part of the known causes of poor mental health in the workplace, there might be ways you can augment other elements to offset, some of the things you can't change. I think that's probably the best answer I have, mostly because I don't really work in the area of the psychological standard very well. I know it. I reviewed it for my 2019 report, and I do know that the Mental Health Commission of Canada did do a study looking at the implementation of the Canadian standards when they first came out, and they noted it was difficult. That a lot of the organizations had trouble, but when they did work through those issues, they had significant benefits that they experienced, but it was hard going. And I think we're going to be finding a lot more of that happening. People trying networking to talk more about how to implement the standards effectively, and with a minimum of disruption.
Right, and we've actually reached out to the Mental Health Commission. We're hoping that they'll be able to do a session with us next year. For those of you who want to learn more about that, we're just trying to work with them on that at the moment. So just keep that in mind and keep watch out for it. It probably won't be till next year. But next question is, you had noted that there was a possibly adverse effect of R2MR. What was it? What was that possibly adverse effect?
Yeah, so for R2MR, I want to say off the bat that I was actually part of the Canadian Armed Forces Advisory Committee that oversaw the development of R2MR, so I do know a fair bit about it. R2MR was initially supposed to be rolled out and evaluated from the get-go, but because of the pace of deployments to Afghanistan, that evaluation never really happened. So the first formal evaluation of R2MR was Nick Carleton's study, which showed there was no effect at all on on mental health impacts. My colleague at D&D, Denise Fickertolo, she did a randomized control trial of R2MR at the recruit school in Saint-Jean and found no real effects. But that's the one study that showed potential negative effects, and that is that people in the R2MR group where there was no fidelity check, in other words, where there was no check on making sure the instructors kept to the program and didn't go off book, those people in that program had a greater likelihood of leaving the program. In other words, now that could be that maybe that R2MR was successful and they realized that this was not for them. They didn't have the skills, but there may have been something else in that. So poor fidelity with R2MR can have negative effects, I think, is how that can be interpreted. But again, R2MR has no other really significant effects at improving mental health, nothing known. And I want to say that there's mixed evidence around stigma reduction, but there's also a meta-analysis by Clement et al. In 2015 that showed a zero correlation between mental health self-stigma and treatment-seeking behavior. So, if you're going to be putting in a mental health prevention program and your main purpose is stigma reduction for the purposes of increasing treatment-seeking behavior, there's no correlation there to begin with. So, that to me is a spurious outcome.
Good to know. What impact do you think, or does or could peer support programs have on burnout?
Oh, peer support is one of those interesting areas where when you look at the literature, there's really mixed bag of evidence suggesting that they are effective at managing, maintaining, or preventing poor mental health in the workplace, but people like them. So given the known causes of burnout are organizational, it's not the individual that is the cause of burnout, but they are experiencing the symptoms. So like anything, I would say that having a peer support is probably a comforting element and may help people get into, if they are experiencing as a result of the burnout, because remember there's that high correlation with depression, and there's also a high correlation with anxiety. People who are more highly experienced, who are experiencing more high symptoms of burnout, are more likely to experience symptoms of depression and anxiety, sleep disturbance. So it may be that people who are high in burnout should be seeking psychological treatment, not for the burnout, but for the mental health outcomes of burnout. I think peer support might be a really good way of helping people, get into treatment and find treatment and support them through the treatment process.
Our next question is, what burnout factors at an organizational level do you think are the most amenable to change? Where would be a good location for them to start?
Yeah, that is really up to the individual organization. As I was saying earlier, you may not be able to, in a public safety environment, you may not be able to manage job demand unless you hire more people. But unless you have the budget to hire more people, you're kind of stuck, aren't you? So when I was doing my 2019 report on the scoping review on prevention and early intervention programs and their effectiveness, I did a lot of SME interviews with subject matter experts, and only one organization that I spoke with actually was increasing their budget for hiring. And that was in Australia, and it was the Victorian, ambulance service. And so everybody else was cutting back. So if you're cutting back on staffing, they're not going to. What you're doing is you're putting a choke point there. So I think organizations can probably have to pick and choose what they can do, and some of them are going to have to make a concerted effort. But job demand is really one of the biggest, and job control is also the other element, and then job support. Those are the three main factors affecting burnout. And I just want to say that I spent 15 years working in national defense, and I also saw this in my work, my interviews with police, and that is that there's almost a sense of pride around being double-hatted and triple-hatted in the workplace. In other words, you're being given 2 jobs to do instead of 1. Or you're given 3 jobs to do instead of 1. And so your FTE goes from 1.0, maybe it was never 1.0, maybe it was 1.50, and now it's 2.0 or 3.0. And there's almost a sense of pride in that, especially in a professional community. And I would argue that is, that's not an appropriate way of, or that's not a healthy way of thinking. So yeah.
Next question is, can you discuss the difference in symptoms between burnout and traumatic stress? So not PTSD specifically, but just traumatic stress at that level, the lower level.
Yeah. I have to say, PTS is not necessarily my, my main bag. I know that, so you have to have trauma. There has to be a trauma event for PTS to happen, or post-traumatic stress to happen. And then really, then you become then basically you either experience some symptoms which decline over a period of time or increase over a period of time. And a lot of people experience some initial symptoms, but they decline over time and they don't become PTSD. And other people, for a smaller percentage of the people, they actually do develop PTSD. So PTSD is highly comorbid with depression. It is an anxiety disorder, and anxiety and depression are correlated with burnout. The causes are very different, and I think the fact that one is as a diagnosable clinical condition and one is not. I like to think of burnout as a symptom of a poor workplace that has negative health and mental health outcomes. So I think that there's the overlap between PTSD and burnout, but the causes are really very different. One's more of a low-grade workplace workplace stress. I hate to use the word toxic workplace, but I can throw that in there if you like. Whereas, again, trauma is, or PTSD is trauma-based. But again, the negative elements of the workplace probably do not help, people's experience with PTS symptoms or post-traumatic stress symptoms. So I'm going to leave it at that for a second, because I think I'm going way out of my area of expertise there.
For sure. So we do have a number of questions left, but we are kind of getting to the end of our time. I will have one more question answered, and then we will wrap it up. I will send these questions on to Dr. McCreary, and he can, with the information to contact you, and he can, if he has the expertise in it, he can let you know. If he doesn't, he'll let you know that as well. If everybody's all right with that. If you're all right with that, Dr. McCreary?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. So last question we want to ask then is, do you think the focus on mindfulness and the industry that's rapidly growing around it to deploy those techniques in the workplace could be ultimately harmful because of the speed probably that it's moving at?
Oh, okay. That's a tough question, because mindfulness is not a silver bullet. There actually are adverse effects for mindfulness. There are adverse events in RCTs, for mindfulness training. People think it's perfectly harmless, but it's not. It actually, there are negative effects from burnout. There's not burnout, from mindfulness training. The fact that it's going into the workplace, I think, is a good thing. But if it's only going into the workplace as an intervention because the organization wants to kind of reduce mindfulness or improve mental health because they know that there's a problem and they don't want to change themselves, that could be problematic. In fact, I posted something yesterday on my LinkedIn account that said that there was a study that showed that when organizations instituted mindfulness training as a way of managing burnout and poor mental health, the workers got cynical and angry, because they know that the reasons for the for their feelings are within the workplace, yet they are being shouldered with the burden of managing the workplace causes, so they get highly cynical and very angry. But I also know that when you move mindfulness into the workplace, mindfulness has been adapted. So the standard mindfulness techniques are longer if you take them personally than the workplace wants. So the first thing the workplace wants you to do is cut down the amount of time spent meditating. In other words, for the training. And I remember I once took a workplace mindfulness course with somebody who signed up for the course but refused to do the meditation because she felt her work was so important that she just was, she just couldn't spare the time, to do the mindfulness training. So I'm not blaming the organization entirely. Sometimes we as individuals come into these kinds of environments with unrealistic expectations, about how they work, and unwillingness to give it the time that it needs. So I think that's a complex area, but you're right. There's no silver bullet. There's growing evidence to show that it works, but again, it's not the only thing, and it places the burden on the individual as opposed to the known cause, which is the organization. Sorry, yeah, I can step off my soapbox now. Yeah. I want to keep wanting to remind organizations that about the evidence, and there we go.
Perfect. All right. Well, I want to thank you for being here today, and everyone in our audience, for this great session. There'll be a quick survey at the end of the session. We hope that you'll take a moment to complete it. We'll be hosting our next town hall on December the 9th, and it is titled, actually appropriately, Implementing Workplace and Mental Health Interventions in Public Safety Organizations, and that is being done by Dr. Megan Edgelow. We'll also be hosting a learning session on December 1st for the PSP Mental Health website. A link for these sessions will be in your follow-up email with the recording of today's session. Thank you again for attending this town hall. I encourage everyone to take care and stay safe. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming.